Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 30. A Hollow Victory. Pain ripped through Ruby as she shifted slightly in her bed. Though most of it radiated from her broken arm, her entire body ached too. She'd pushed her semblance more than she should have, carried Weiss for longer than she'd ever carried anyone before, and even 24 hours later, she could still feel the effects. Her body had almost zero energy, the fatigue so much that she could barely get up and walk, even with how many cookies and hot chocolates Blake brought up to her. The battle had definitely taken its toll on her, and even though her aura was accelerating the healing, she knew from overhearing her dad talk to Madame Mallory that it would take at least 2 more days to heal properly. Though that was only if she kept her body's energy level up, which it clearly was not interested in doing. The only other thing she'd been told to do was rest, and considering how tired she was more than happy to do that. So she let out a small groan and leaned back into Yang's warm body, the strong arms immediately wrapping tighter around her. As she laid there, she thought back on what had happened after they'd left the cave, and she couldn't help but be a little ashamed. When the Hulk had emerged from the collapse, she panicked. She'd barely registered how injured it was, which was apparently just the fact it had lived had actually scared her. She'd put her whole team in danger, enacted a plan that was far too risky, and then talked not only her sister into it, but her girlfriend and best friend. Had her dad and Team CFEY not been there, they wouldn't have walked away. And then when she saw her dad and Yang run after it, it had been too much. She'd been so scared she was about to lose them, just like she'd lost her mother, that she tried her best to get to them. She knew in hindsight that was incredibly stupid of her, that she would have just been a hindrance without her aura, but in that moment, it was the only thing that made sense to her. And the damage had definitely been done. Ruby had heard Madame Mallory tell her father that her struggling had made the injury worse and caused an extra day of healing, but Ruby didn't really care about that. No, she cared more about what she had done to Yatsu. In her stupidity, she'd forced Coco to order her friend to use his semblance. A semblance he hated, that he took an oath not to use unless the circumstances were dire due to something in his past he had never revealed. And despite her memories having returned less than an hour after waking up, the gargantuan man had been knelt on her bedroom floor with his head on his hands asking for her forgiveness. The very sight of it had made Ruby feel sick and ashamed. He had nothing to apologize for. He'd done nothing wrong. The blame was all hers. She shouldn't have panicked. She shouldn't have struggled. She shouldn't have convinced her team to stay and fight against that monster. She shouldn't have had to be saved when they could have gotten away. Yatsu using his semblance, Blake's injured leg, Yang's concussion. All of that was on her for failing to be a good enough leader. As she felt a tear fall down her face and onto her pillow, she sniffled and Yang's hand on her stomach tightened and pulled her further into the hug. Ruby remembered the commotion she heard the night before when Yang had finally woken up. She'd listened as people had tried to stop the brawler from leaving her own room only to be met with shouted retorts, and sat up in shock when Yang had burst into the room on wobbly legs with her hair blazing so bright that it lit up the dark room. And the woman had straight up refused to leave the bed for anything other than the toilet since she crawled into it. "I'm sorry," Ruby whimpered and moved her good arm up to wipe her cheek. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," Yang breathed softly. "Everything okay?" "MHM." "Liar," Yang replied without hesitation and let out a grunt as she shifted a little. "If you're gonna force me to talk, you have to do the same." Ruby didn't reply. She knew Yang was right, and that it was hypocritical to expect something and not do it herself, but she knew what Yang would do. She would try and comfort her, try and tell her she was wrong, but Ruby knew she wasn't. She knew she had failed, and she needed to be told that. She needed someone to confirm it and tell her to be better. "Hey," Yang breathed quietly and carefully turned her over so that their eyes met. Despite the obvious pain that moving caused, the blonde's hand came up to wipe the tears away. "Talk to me." The simple word felt strangled as her throat closed and more tears rolled down her cheeks. What could she even say? How did she apologize for almost getting her sister killed? Even as Yang pulled her in closer and rested her chin on the top of her head, all she could do was repeat her earlier statement. "I'm sorry." Ruby's hands gripped Yang's shirt as tight as they could, which she knew wasn't very, and she let herself be pulled into the hug. The warmth of her sister rushed over her, and the gentle thudding of the older woman's heartbeat against her forehead, as strong as ever, comforting her in the fact that it meant the girl was alive. After a couple of seconds though, she felt the chest deflate as a loud sigh was let out. "Idiot," Yang said, her tone soft but firm. "You lost your cool." "What?" Ruby thought to herself at those words. Was Yang really scolding her? "You could have been hurt," Yang continued. "You could have died." She paused and let out another sigh. "Is that really what you want to hear?" It was, so Ruby gave a small nod. "Fine." Ruby felt Yang take a deep breath, and the hand that was stroking her cheek moved to gently play with her hair. It was a comforting action that Ruby didn't feel she deserved. "Your plan was stupid," Yang continued. "Reckless, with no planning and thought about what you'd do if it failed. And when it failed, you freaked out. You put Dad in danger by holding up Coco's team so they couldn't help, and I had to go in on low aura to help him instead." The words flooded Ruby with relief, but also shame. The words only hurt because they were true, and the fact that Yang was able to pick them out only proved that further. "But," Yang breathed lovingly. "Me, Blake, Weiss, we all went along with your plan. We are just as much at fault." "But it was my PL." "It was." Yang cut off her choked words. "But you didn't force us into it. You said you would leave if we wanted, but we chose to stay. You didn't fail as a leader, Ruby. We failed as a team. Led by Emmy." Ruby pouted and gave another soft sniffle. "Yup," Yang said, though the cadence of her voice was different. It almost sounded prideful. "My amazing little sis, who lets her team choose what they want to do. And we chose Ruby. So stop apologizing for it. Please." Despite her own thoughts that the scolding wasn't enough, she knew Yang was done with it. She'd said what she needed to say, laid the blame where she thought it belonged, and that was that. "But that doesn't matter." Yang resumed the gentle massage of her scalp as she spoke in a soothing voice. "The plan might not have been the best, but it still worked. The Hulk is dead. You should be proud of that." Ruby felt Yang take a deep breath as the massage slowed, but after a second, the breath was released. "I know Mom would be." That was the last thing Ruby wanted to hear, but at the same time, it was somehow comforting. Yang had always been the one to tell her about their mom, her adventures, and everything she did at home, and though Ruby knew some of it was exaggerated, she also knew a lot of it wasn't. She trusted Yang whenever she talked seriously about their mom, and doubted she would make that up just to make her feel better, so she gave another sniffle and sank deeper into Yang's chest. And that was where she stayed. She didn't know for how long. It could have been an hour, could have been more. The tears eventually stopped, but Yang never stopped consoling her. The strong hands gently stroked her hair, massaged her scalp, rubbed her back. Everything Yang had been doing her whole life. And while Ruby let it all slowly calm her mind, she listened to the gentle heartbeat. After a while, she felt her eyes start to close as her body struggled to maintain the energy to stay awake, but just as she was about to give herself to the slumber, a small knock on the door jolted her awake. "What?" Yang's voice was polite, but Ruby detected an obvious hint of annoyance in it. Nevertheless, she turned as the door opened and saw Blake stood in the entryway holding a small tray. Her ears were folded to show that she too had heard the annoyance in Yang's voice, but they quickly perked back up as she entered and placed the tray on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" the girl asked. "Any better?" "Headache is going away," Yang replied with a groan as she sat up in the bed. "Still feel like shit though." "Good." Blake smiled and passed her a strawberry milkshake. "Means you're alive." "Ah, always knew you cared about me really." "I was talking to Ruby." Blake grinned, and Yang gasped in false outrage as she took the drink. "I'm good," Ruby replied sullenly. "Same as Yang, honestly." "Yeah, well you took some heavy hits. Here." Ruby used one hand to force herself into a sitting position, but quickly felt a hand slip under her armpit to help her. With a quick glance to her side, she saw Yang was engrossed in her shake, so figured it was likely an unconscious move on the blonde's part. She turned back to Blake and took the hot chocolate that was passed to her. "Thanks," she said, as the fauna sat down on the edge of the bed with a wince of her own. The involuntary reaction sent another wave of remorse through Ruby. "How's your leg?" "Healed." The girl smiled effortlessly. "Just another scar now." "Good." Ruby let out a breath of relief and took a sip of her delicious drink. It was clear that Blake had made it due to just how much cocoa powder had been added. Since the last time Weiss had made her one, it tasted more of milk than chocolate. Not that she minded too much. She liked milk, especially with cookies, but recovery always required more energy. However, as Ruby sipped her drink, she saw Blake cast a furtive glance at the blonde. "Hey, Young," she said carefully. "Do you think we could have a minute? Alone?" Ruby looked at her sister and saw her eyes squint in immediate annoyance. She knew the answer that was likely going to be given, since she had outright refused to leave when Coco and Yatsu had come in to apologize. She waited with bated breath, ready to apologize to Blake, but much to her surprise, Yang's face softened a few seconds later, and she gave a small nod. "I need the toilet anyway," she said, and slowly worked her way out of the bed, using the windowsill to help her up. "I think your dad wants to talk to you too." "Kay!" The blonde grunted and started to take cautious steps towards the door. Thankfully, though, she was a lot better than the night before, where she had dropped to her knees the second she charged into the room. "You got 15 minutes. Once the brawler was out of the room, and they were left alone, Blake stood up and walked to shut the door before she walked back. Ruby watched the girl circle the bed to where Yang had been laid earlier, and sit down beside her again. Silence filled the air between the two for a second, Ruby unsure what to say since they had barely talked since their little make-out session at Blaze Lake that ended in disaster. But knowing Yang was definitely coming back soon, Ruby knew they didn't have long, so put her hot chocolate aside and looked down at her knees. "Are you really okay?" she muttered. "A little tired, but healing," Blake replied quietly, and leant her head against the headboard. "Ruby, we should talk about yesterday." Ruby didn't think Blake would be one to criticize her plan, but then again, she hadn't thought Yang would actually do it either. She'd expected Coco, or Velvet at least. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pushed that plan." "Not that." Blake cut her off with a sigh. "I've already said I will go along with the plans you make. That hasn't changed." Blake paused and Ruby sensed a becoming. "But I don't like what you did yesterday." Blake took a deep breath, and Ruby waited patiently for whatever the girl was going to berate her for. Whatever it was, she knew she deserved it anyway. "I know you are willing to sacrifice yourself for people. I've come to terms with that. But please, don't sacrifice yourself for me. I don't want that." Blake's amber eyes found her own, and Ruby felt shame overcome her again. "I don't want to live with that. I don't care about the circumstances. I am not someone you should sacrifice yourself for." Ruby stared at her girlfriend for a minute, and took in the sincerity of her words. Though the girl's voice was calm, there was an undercurrent of seriousness there that told her that she wanted to make sure the words had been heard. And they had. Ruby remembered trying to get Blake out during the fight, remembered Blake shouting at her, and refusing to leave unless they both got out. And she also remembered Blake's promise back at Gratitude Ruins, where she had said she was going to do her best to make sure Ruby sacrificing herself wouldn't have to happen. It seemed to be a very strong point for her, something she was actually going to try and make sure didn't happen, so Ruby gave her a small nod. "I just didn't want you to die for my mistake," Ruby mumbled and slumped back down in the bed, since her body was beginning to ache from sitting up. "There were more grim than usual, and I saw scratch marks in the tunnel as we were leaving. I should have known something was wrong, that the Helk had been using it. I keep having to remind you of this, but I'm a huntress too, Ruby," Blake said. To Ruby's surprise, Blake copied her, and shifted down on the bed too as she rolled over to face her. "You're not the only one who should be recognizing those signs. I'm the tracker of the team too." "But this is my home," Ruby countered and turned so that she was also looking at Blake, whose amber eyes were once again soft, like she was reading a book she was particularly fond of. "I should have realized something was wrong." She bit her lip as she contemplated saying what she really wanted to. After only a couple of seconds of contemplation though, she remembered what Yang had just said, and released her lip while scooting closer. "But when I'm with you, I keep forgetting," she breathed as Blake's hand. "I have so much fun that I forget to check my surroundings. I forget sometimes too." Blake moved a little closer, and Ruby felt the hand on her hip move around to her lower back. "I think I enjoy spending time with you more than I do reading." "Wow!" Ruby exclaimed, taken aback by such a compliment. It was so big that despite their conversation, she couldn't help but chuckle. "That's quite a compliment." "Well, it's true," Blake smiled in return. "Books were always my escape into a world that was free of my own troubles, and even then I felt like there was something wrong with most of them. I could always tell they weren't completely real. But with you, I don't need to escape anything, and nothing has felt as real as this. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I really, really like you." Ruby gazed happily into her girlfriend's gorgeous amber eyes and moved her hand up to wipe her own. What had just been said had probably been one of her favorite things ever, including having been told she was going to Beacon. Thank you, she stuttered, but quickly realized she should really say more. I really like you too. More than, cress. No. Cookies. Definitely more than cookies. Blake's face split into a grin, and she pressed forward to place a gentle kiss on her lips. It was clear she was going easy for fear of hurting her, but Ruby thought the pressure was just right for how much she still ached. After she pulled away though, Blake raised a hand, and Ruby felt it rest gently on her chin as the thumb stroked her cheek. Good. Blake smiled, but it quickly dropped and her tone became semi-serious again. So please don't make me have to go through losing you before we're at least like 50. The ridiculous age pulled a snort from Ruby, and Blake let out a small chuckle of her own. Not many huntsmen make it to that age, Ruby laughed. Well, none of them are you, the fauness replied smoothly. Ruby felt her heart swell, and her face warm, and Blake stared directly into her eyes. Though it was undoubtedly said to fluster her, the voice held a hint of truth, like the girl really believed she would be better than the rest one day. The mere fact that Blake could even potentially believe something like that put a heat in her stomach, and Ruby felt her mood lift, even if only a little. However, before Ruby could show just how appreciative she was, the door opened and Yang walked in, followed by Weiss. "Aw, soft Betty goodness," Yang groaned as she fell back into the bed, not bothering to move Blake, and simply throwing her arm over them both instead. "What do you say, Weiss? Team hug?" "No, thank you," the heiress said with a reproachful scowl at the blonde as she sat on her own bed. Of the four of them, Weiss seemed to be the healthiest, though Ruby knew she was likely pushing herself. So long as it wasn't too much, she would allow it. "We do need to talk, though." "What about?" Ruby asked curiously as she shifted to get more comfortable, since the bed was suddenly rather cramped. "Dad," Yang replied with a satisfied groan as she relaxed back into the mattress. "He spoke to Ojban, and apparently we can take an extra day off if we need it. Weiss isn't that enthused about it." "Tomorrow is only orientation," the aforementioned girl replied. "Yes, we can miss it, but then we will be traveling on an actual school day and likely have to make up for a missed class." Weiss has a point," Blake replied, and moved Yang's arm lower since it was covering her face. "We aren't really going to be doing anything strenuous tomorrow anyway." "Speak for yourself. Walking to that bathroom is a bitch." Ruby tapped her sister. "Weiss is right," she said, despite agreeing that walking even that short a distance was a pain. "We can't miss a day of school when we're fine." "Humph," Yang grumbled and retrieved her milkshake from the nightstand. "Bunchaw goody 6 shoes." "Good," Weiss said, and pulled out her scroll as she stood up. "I shall order a courier service to take our belongings up to Beacon tonight. Would rather not be stuck carrying your things. Maybe you can shove me into a bag and have them courier me," Yang hissed as she straightened out. "Save me walking." As the whole team shook their heads at the weak attempt at a pun, Ruby cuddled deeper into her girlfriend and gave a small smile. Her disappointment at herself hadn't completely vanished, but the fact she had talked about it seemed to have helped her a little. She would have brought it up with Weiss too, but she knew if the girl had any issues, they would have been mentioned immediately, so that was all the answer she needed there. So as she cuddled into her girlfriend and engaged in small talk with her friends, Ruby finally let one victory wash over her. They had done something no huntsman or huntress had done before. They'd killed the Helk, the most dangerous thing on the island. And while something would inevitably rise to take its place, the Helk's death meant the people of the island were safer. And even though she wished it had been done better, she could at least be proud of that. Chapter 31, Back to Basics. The loud horn of the harbored ship caused Blake to flinch as she waited for her teammates. The loud noises of trade and laughter filled every inch of the port, and Blake couldn't help but notice a stark difference from when she had arrived. Compared to 2 weeks ago, when the place had been more silent and peaceful with people simply trying to get their business done, the residents of Patch seemed to actually be loitering. A few stalls that had not been there previously had been erected, and people surrounded them to talk happily to each other. The dock was even packed to the point where Blake was beginning to wish Patch had adopted Menagerie's wider roads. Weiss sat at her side, her legs and arms crossed while she watched the sisters talk excitedly to Ty. Though she was trying to play it off as impatience, Blake could see a hint of curiosity behind those piercing blue eyes. She didn't dare mention what she saw, of course, since the both of them shared the same touchiness regarding family, but Blake definitely knew the heiress was thinking about something. "The ship is gonna take off without us if they don't hurry," Coco grumbled as her and her team returned from their excursion to a nearby clothing stall. "Should have just stayed in bed at this rate." "How are you not used to early mornings yet?" Weiss asked, her eyes finally breaking away from the family. "She misses having Yang in the bee." Fox's thoughts were cut off as Coco punched him in the arm. "Coco has been like this ever since we met," Yatsu said as he sat down on the ground with crossed legs and laid his great sword, Fulcrum, next to him. "Velvet is the only one of us allowed to wake her up." "That's because Fox dumped a bottle of water on her. And you let him." Blake let out a small chuckle, and Weiss raised an eyebrow as a remorseful look passed over Yatsu's face for a second. But it passed quickly. Anyone who knew Team CFEY knew that it wasn't just Velvet and Coco who were close, but all four of them were. It wasn't uncommon to see Fox getting Yatsuhashi into some sort of trouble, or for Coco and Fox to be giggling about people. Velvet had even confided in Blake that Yatsu had asked her lessons on how not to offend Faunus. The man still had some ways to go, but it was always clear he never meant to do it, and was making a genuine effort to change. That's more than can be said for a lot of people, Blake thought to herself as she reached up to adjust her ribbon. It felt weird to be wearing it again after 2 weeks without it. "Here they come!" Weiss sighed and stood up. "Finally!" Blake looked back over to her girlfriend and partner to see them hugging their dad, before pulling away with a wave. He had mentioned having to patrol the west with a small recon team that the council had sent, but he'd put aside just enough time to see them to the docks. But it appeared that time was up, since he quickly took off at a sprint into the woods while the other two girls began to slowly make their way over. "Hey, all good?" Blake asked as Ruby sat down in the spot that had been saved for her. "Yup," the leader replied with a sheepish smile. "It's good to see this place so busy again." "Well, that's all because of you four," Coco said with a grin as she leaned against Yang. "As stupid a plan as it was, it worked. You should have seen the people in town yesterday. Looked like a festival was about to break out. Right, Vels?" "Yeah," the Faunus said with a wide smile as she too pressed up against Yang's arm. "You four are heroes of Patch." "Heh." Yang snorted and reached up to scratch her head. "Not real." Velvet reached up to place a kiss on the blonde's cheek as her hand slipped into Yang's. "Okay, kind of a big deal. That definitely deserves more rewards." Blake shook her head and gave a chuckle as Coco leaned in to give Yang exactly that. Instead, she looked at Ruby and gave her a small smile. From the slightly downcast look, she knew Coco's comment about it being a stupid plan had definitely struck the girl. But from what Yang had said, Ruby wanted the truth. And Blake could hardly argue with Coco. She was always willing to follow Ruby and let the girl order her around, but even she had to admit that the correct course of action would have been to run. They were already too low on aura, and it had been sheer luck that they had survived. Had Tai and CFEY taken any longer to get to the cave, then they definitely wouldn't have. However, she had agreed to the plan too. Not just because Ruby wholeheartedly believed in that moment that the plan would work, but because she did too. As stupid as it was, Ruby couldn't have known that the hell could survive being buried by a small mountain. None of them could. "How's the arm?" Blake whispered, since everyone else was in conversation. "Better," Ruby said dully and shifted the arm, which rested in a sling. "Still hurts a little, but at least I can move it now." Blake hummed thoughtfully, really not keen on seeing a normally happy look so down. "Enough for me to not do this?" She reached her arm around the girl's waist and slipped her hand into her girlfriend's. Almost immediately, the thin digits closed over the back of her hand, and Blake couldn't help but be glad by how strong Ruby's grip was. She was also happy at the fact that a small smile had begun to pull at the Reaper's lips. "That's fine." "Good." Blake grinned back and flicked her book open so that Ruby could read it. "What's this one, Abio?" "Hey, nuh-uh," Coco said and snapped her fingers. "No cuddling. You can do that when we get on the ship, which is gonna take off soon." "All right." Blake sighed and took note of the page for later as she closed the book. "You don't sound so excited about going back to school," Ruby remarked as they stood, Blake's arm still around her girlfriend's waist. "I dunno." Blake shrugged as they made their way after the others towards the boat. "It's been nice being able to just be myself for a few weeks." She didn't need to say it because Ruby's eyes flicked up to the bow, and a small scowl settled on her face. I definitely prefer you without the bow, Ruby said with a downcast look, though she quickly looked back up with a hopeful expression. But maybe one day you won't have to wear it. Maybe, Blake replied noncommittally. She didn't technically have to wear it, but it certainly made things easier. Definitely not today, though. Okay, Ruby smiled as she squeezed her hand tighter. No pressure. Blake gave the girl a warm smile as they stepped onto the ramp to board the ship. She really liked that Ruby thought her ears were cute. Normally it felt weird, like the people saying it felt the need to point out that they weren't bothered by it, and that in and of itself had a tendency to get tiring. But with Ruby, the comment didn't feel directed to her ear at all. It felt to Blake like the girl was just talking about hiding a part of her in general. With that knowledge in mind, she made a mental note to take the bow off a little more when she was in their dorm room, and continued her way up the ramp. However, as they were halfway up, she heard hurried footsteps behind her that were quickly followed by a loud shout. Hey, Ruby Young! Wait! All 8 of them turned to see a middle-aged woman with forest green hair jogging towards them with a large basket in her hand. The woman was either not used to running, or had run a long way, but since the main town was not too far away, Blake had to assume the former. As she approached, though, she slowed down slightly until she reached the ramp, where she stopped to catch her breath. Kelly? Young asked and made her way back, an impatience groan coming from Coco, who was quickly tapped by Velvet. What are you doing here? I want to say before. Why don't you catch your breath first? Ruby said kindly and took a step forward. Kelly gave a small nod and placed a hand on her hip as she did what Ruby said. After almost a minute, during which the captain shouted for them to hurry up, the woman finally appeared to have recovered enough to speak. I wanted to catch you before you left, the store owner said in what was still a tired voice. To bring you these. The green-haired woman held out the basket, and Yang quickly reached out to grab it. She pulled back the lid to reveal a massive supply of cookies and cakes that would easily keep the sisters happy for a couple of days. Ruby's eyes lit up immediately as she spotted what was clearly a trove of treasure for the young reaper. My store was the first place your mother would stop by whenever she returned from a mission, and I would always let her take whatever she wanted, Kelly explained with a fond smile. I figured it was only right that I do the same for her daughters, especially after what you have done for us. That's... Ruby looked away from the baked goods and looked at the smiling woman. That's really not necessary. It was out, Jay. Yes. It was just your job. Kelly laughed and gave a dismissive wave. Summer used to say that every time too. But me and Beryl want to show just how grateful we are for you doing that job. People like you. She turned to motion to both teams. All of you, you give people like us hope. And everyone on Patch is eternally grateful for that. Ruby and Yang simply stood there. However, both of their reactions were different. Yang's was one of awkwardness as she sheepishly scratched her head, while Ruby looked like someone had punched her in the face. Her mouth hung slightly open and her silver eyes were wide as she surveyed the woman. However, before she could recover properly, the captain called again and Weiss let out a loud, exasperated sigh. Then it would be rude of us not to accept your thanks, Mrs. Vierdian, the girl said and plucked the basket from Yang's hand. But it is just enough to know that we help people. Right, Ruby? Oh, yes, the leader said as she snapped to attention. We are just happy to help. Well, help is certainly what you did. Kelly smiled happily. The people of Patch will rest easier now that horrid beast is gone. But I should let you go before the captain brings a whole new evil our way. Have fun at Beacon, girls. With those final words, the woman gave another friendly wave and moved away from the ship. Just in time, too, since the captain had clearly had enough. I don't care if you are huntresses, you either get on the fucking ship now, or I raise this ramp, and you swim your asses to Vale. Your choice. All right, Yang shouted back and stomped up the ramp. Grouchy asshole. Come on, you two, let's go sail the high schnees. Weiss let out an audible groan at the awful pun, and as they made their way back onto the ship, Blake noticed that Ruby was still a little dumbfounded by what had happened. So with a wide grin of her own, she bumped her girlfriend's shoulder and stuck out her tongue. When they finally did make it to the ship, however, she pulled a cookie from the basket and handed it to the younger girl. A reward you definitely earned, she said kindly. It took Ruby a second, But as the ramp finally began to rise, she reached out and took the baked good with a small smile that felt genuine enough to raise Blake's spirits too. Blake was already missing the quiet solitude of Patch as she dropped out of the bulkhead onto Beacon's landing pad. The sound of excitable students filled the air as people milled around the courtyard catching up. She could hear friends happy to see each other again, weapons being cleaned and loaded, people exchanging gifts, even a few rivalries resuming in the distance that would inevitably lead to a scrap on the grass. Such things were not uncommon at Beacon. She could also see a few teachers sitting at a table a fair distance from the rest of the students. They seemed to be going over paperwork, but there was so much noise that Blake was unable to hear what they were working on. "Ah, it's so good to be back," Ruby said happily and bounced to the front of the group. It was amazing what some double chocolate cookies could do to the girl's mood after a day of rest. "I missed it so much. Look at the... You have seen all the weapons before, sis." Yang chuckled from above, but quickly jumped down from the bulkhead. "But they are never all out together," Ruby said happily. "Everyone keeps them in their locker. But they are all out, and clean and gorgeous." "The things you consider gorgeous worry me," Wise sighed as she descended her stairway of glyphs. "I'll try not to take that too personally." Blake scowled at her friend, who simply gave a shrug. "You're not my type." "But she is mine," Ruby said happily and bounced back to take her hand. "And the only weapon here more beautiful than you is Crescent Rose." It was rare for Ruby to be so forward with her compliments, especially in front of others, so Blake felt her cheeks warm slightly as a smile pulled at her lips. "Thanks." Blake grinned back and leaned down to give her a kiss, before putting on a sultry voice and reciting a line from a novel she'd read recently. "But my beauty pales in comparison to the wonder of the world before me." The loud sound of Yang retching behind her caused a massive smile to appear on her face, but she could hardly argue that the line was exceptionally cheesy. However, as cheesy as it was, it caused Ruby's cheeks to burn red and her hand to flap wildly in front of her face. "Oh, Sto. You have got to be joking." Wise's frustrated voice cut off Ruby's chuckled response and earned the attention of everyone. The girl had her head buried in her hands, her fingers only slightly parted to see ahead of her. Looking over Ruby's head to whatever the heiress was hiding from, it didn't take long to see what had caused the girl such clear distress. "Hey, Blake!" Even Blake let out a groan at the voice, as did Yang. Rolling towards them with a rainbow trailing behind her and an enormous grin on her face was Neon Cat. "Guess who transferred to Beacon? Me, isn't that awesome?" Why?" she said, unable to say more, though quickly received a poke from Ruby. "I mean, sure." Though she didn't particularly dislike Neon, the girl did have a tendency to get on her nerves with just how peppy and loud she could be. That, along with her narrow views on how faunus were treated, made her feel a lot more tired about the fact she would likely have to deal with the girl more in the future. "Atlas never really felt right for us," said another voice, this time a male one. Another groan sounded from Weiss as Flint stepped out from behind a group of nearby students. "Too many white collars and whatnot. Vale's a lot freer, you catch my drift?" Blake certainly felt like she caught his drift, from the way his eyes flicked to his partner, but with how Weiss was pointedly turning her nose up at the boy and Yang was trying to make herself look busy by talking to Velvet, she was sure they missed it. "Yeah, Vale is super fun," Ruby said happily. Clearly she missed the meaning too. "It's cool you guys have transferred here though. So how was your break?" "Awful," Neon said, her colors dampening considerably. "There was this crazy big grim attack our first week back, and look what they did to my poor, beautiful tail." The Rainbow Girl's tail came swinging around and hung in front of Blake's face. She wasn't quite sure what she was looking at for a couple of seconds, but then she saw it. Neon usually kept the end neatly organized with rings, but it was fluffy and frayed, while the hair was slightly discolored. She recognized it immediately as scar tissue. Furthermore, as she followed the appendage down, she noticed that it was definitely shorter than when they'd last seen each other. It appeared that a chuck had definitely been taken out of it, and knowing how much Neon loved her tail, Blake actually felt bad for the girl. 4 inches, the girl said incredulously. 4 whole inches of perfection gone. I'm sorry to hear th. Wait. Weiss interrupted and stepped forward to squint at the girl. I was in Atlas the first week of break. I heard nothing about a grim invasion. Of course you didn't, girlie, said Ivory, the third member of Team FNKI who liked to wear tight-fitting, white and beige suits that showed off a large portion of his chest. His gray hair hung just over his eyes, and flamboyance radiated from every cell of the boy's body. Next to him stood Cobalt, his blue-haired partner, who preferred to wear a plain light blue shirt and darker jeans. 2 pauldrons covered his shoulders, and a single gauntlet covered his left forearm. Since when haven't legions ever bothered to pay attention to Mandel's issues? Excuse me, Weiss said testily, and took a step towards the boy, but Ruby cut her off. Ivory, cool it, Flint said quickly too, earning a small shrug from his teammate. Blake didn't know too much about Ivory or Cobalt. She knew they had been best friends since they were kids growing up in Mantle, and that Ivory was dating Cobalt's sister, but apart from that, she had never really interacted with him much. Nevertheless, both him and Weiss glared at each other with disdain. Anyways, Neon said, and dropped her tail as her colors returned. How was your break? Have you been talking to Sun? She turned to Ruby. And what happened to your arm? Kind of a long story, Ruby said meekly. Not wanting a topic that brought down Ruby's mood to be brought up again, Blake answered the other question. Sun messaged a few times, but you know how he is, she said to the colorful Faunus. Always disappearing, but always there when you need him. How about you? Yup, the girl said cheerfully. He calls most nights. Blake gave her a small smile. She knew most people would be annoyed that their friend didn't reach out more, but it didn't bother her too much. She wasn't particularly the best at extended conversations with most people, and Sun liked to do his own thing, which often meant disappearing for days on end. But just as she said, Blake knew the boy would be there if she ever needed him. That's good then. For you maybe? Flint scoffed and crossed his arms. You ain't gotta hear them talking all night. Trust me. Weiss scowled and motioned towards Blake, and behind her to Yang. I hear more than I would like. Hey! Ruby pouted towards her best friend as Flint gave a small, amused laugh. However, just as he opened his mouth to say something, the sound of heels clicking against stone approached, and they all turned to see Glinda Goodwitch stalking towards them. She wore her usual white blouse and purple skirt, and in her hand was a large scroll tablet that she was poking at. Mr. Cole, she said sternly as she arrived at their small gathering. You were supposed to report to Professor Port 5 minutes ago. I advise you and your team get a move on. Gotcha. Glinda raised a disapproving eyebrow at Flint, and he quickly course-corrected. I mean, yes, Professor. Come on, team. K. See you around, Blake? Neon said cheerfully and rolled backwards. We are definitely hanging out sometime. Yay, Blake breathed inwardly, though her mood quickly lifted as Ruby pressed into her. Unfortunately, the affection could only last so long as Glinda turned on them and tapped something on her scroll. Miss Rose, you and your team are to report to the headmaster's office right away. Professor Oshman would like a word with you all. Blake felt the Reaper tense in her arms. And Miss Xiaolong, Miss Adele. Due to the annoyance in the teacher's tone, Blake turned to look at her partner and saw that she had practically pinned Coco to a wall, and the two were clearly passionately making out before the interruption. Velvet stood nearby talking to Fox and smirking as she cast them sidelong glances. Continue to use this courtyard as your own personal bedroom, and you will find yourself in detention for the rest of the semester. Sorry, Professor, Coco said immediately as she slipped out of Yang's arms and stood up straight. For as cocky and confident as the woman was, Blake always admired just how respectful she could be to people she looked up to. The teacher's eyes narrowed to slits though, and she turned to stalk away. Once she was gone, Blake looked down at the girl in her own arms and saw that Ruby's face had once again fallen. We should get going, Weiss sighed after a quick look at her partner. I would rather avoid getting in more trouble than we could already be in by keeping Professor Oshman waiting. The heiress didn't bother to wait, and walked down the path at what was clearly a purposely slow pace. I'm sure it's nothing, Blake said kindly, and slipped her hand into Ruby's as the leader pulled away and slowly made her way after Weiss. He probably just wants to debrief us. Yeah, Jan added. He does coordinate all the huntsmen and missions and stuff. I know, the girl said dully. We did collapse a landmark though. Blake could hardly argue with that, and clearly neither could Yang. So she simply settled for squeezing her girlfriend's hand a little tighter as they caught up with Weiss. A small amount of tension filled the inside of the elevator as it slowly ascended to the top of the tower, and though most of it was coming from Ruby and Weiss, Blake felt some emanating from herself too. The fact that they could actually be in trouble was actually encroaching on her. Though Ashbin did take an active role in teaching the students, he often left debriefing of missions to other teachers who headed up the year. Normally it should be Glinda who talked to them after missions and such, even ones such that weren't official and things they just happened upon. The only time Ashbin had taken the lead on their debriefing was when Blake had run away after revealing she was a faunus to her team. She had somehow stumbled into a dust heist at the docks, and after seeing a few white fan members, tried to stop it. Unfortunately, while she managed to keep the dust safe, the main culprit had got away. Ashbin had seemed really interested back then, and questioned her for almost 30 minutes before letting her go. So for him to take the lead against did cause her a little concern. However, she didn't have much time to ponder just how much trouble they were in, if any at all, since the elevator came to a stop and the doors opened. Very slowly, all four of them stepped out. The office itself was actually rather sparse. The only thing that it held was a single desk near the far window, its green glass showing gears beneath that turned slowly. Gears were the running theme through the office though. The patterning of the plain green floor was one giant cog, and numerous heavy, metal gears turned and clicked in the ceiling above them. She had no idea how Ashbin could stand to have the room as his office, as more than an hour of listening to those cogs turn would drive her insane. The man in question sat behind his desk, surveying them over templed fingers as they slowly walked into the office. It was quite hard to believe the man was in his 50s. Apart from the gray hair, which she was certain was natural anyway, he still looked like he could easily pass as a man in his early 30s. That was helped of course by the crisp black and green suits he always wore. "Thank you for coming," the man said kindly and motioned for them to stand in front of his desk. "I understand it has been a busy 2 weeks for the four of you, and you likely want to rest, so I won't keep you too long." "Bit of an understatement," Raalm quipped as they all stood in front of the desk, but Blake gave her a small tap. Ashbin didn't seem to care though, since he let out a small chuckle. "I suppose it is," the man said in a friendly voice as he sat back, though Blake couldn't shake the odd feeling that rushed through her at his gaze. Like he was seeing something that no one else could. "Island patrol, 2 unauthorized missions, and fighting an ancient Grimm is quite a lot to do in 2 weeks. The whole team shifted uncomfortable, and the headmaster definitely saw it as an amused smile stretched across his lips. "You can relax. You are not in trouble." We're not," Ruby said, the confusion in her voice obvious enough to raise Ashbin's eyebrow. "Why would you be?" The question was rhetorical. "You are accompanied by a licensed huntsman for the semi-official mission, and students are not barred from patrols or freelance investigations into Grimm activity. However, while I think you did an excellent job with each of those from the reports that were submitted, they are not the incidents I wish to discuss with you today." "Oh." Ruby was just shocked as when Kelly thanked her earlier, though she recovered quicker and gave the teacher a nervous look. "The hell?" Ashbin gave a slow nod. "That Grimm has stalked the island patch for over a century now. It has survived many battles and killed many huntsmen and hunters who have dared to take it on." Ashbin started and rested his hands on the armrest of his chair. "In fact, it has been on the bounty board since before even I was appointed headmaster. But now, thanks to you and your team, Miss Rose, we can finally remove it." He waved his hand over his desk to produce a list of available missions, and very near the top was the mission in question. For asterisk mission. Extremely dangerous. Find and eliminate the help residing on the island of Patch. Report to Huntsman Relay Office for further information. As they looked at it, Ashbin tapped a few keys on a projected keyboard and the entire box turned red, and the words cleared by Team RWBY of Beacon Academy appeared before vanishing entirely. "That felt oddly satisfying," Wise hummed, and Blake had to suppress a smile. "It certainly did," Ashbin said happily, as he collapsed the mission list again. "There is one more thing to deal with though. The reward." The whole team looked at each other. None of them had expected anything for clearing the mission, especially since they hadn't actually accepted any mission. But Ashbin continued anyway. "Now, normally you would not receive it since you did not technically accept the mission, but I discussed it with the council due to the nature of the situation, and they have seen fit to award half of the mission's reward, which is still a pretty large amount if I say so myself. 69,000 lien has been permitted." Everyone looked at each other yet again, and even Yang was taken aback by the headmaster's revelation. But again, Ashbin continued. "However, I would not be right for me to acknowledge the participation of only one team, while ignoring the contributions of another. Therefore, that money is not entirely yours. Miss Adele and her team will be awarded 11,500 lien to share between them for their efforts in extracting you, and Mr. Xiaolong will be receiving the same. The other 46,000 lien is to be split evenly between you. They were all silent for a moment, taking in what had been said. From the look on all their faces, except Weiss, who seemed unfazed to have been awarded it all, let alone with such a large amount. After a couple of seconds, though, it was Yang who finally recovered first. Holy sh! As much as I am grateful, Professor Ojban. Weiss cut off Yang with a pointed look and stepped forward. I really have no such need for that money. Would it be possible? I'm afraid not, Miss Schnee, Ojban said and held up his hand. The money is to go directly to you. With the exception of the 10% taken from Miss Belladonna's share as per her tuition agreement, I have no say over anything else. What you do after you receive it, however, is up to you. Weiss gave an understanding nod and stepped back, as did Blake. When she had left Menagerie, she had done so without taking any of her family's money. As such, the school had generously offered her financial aid during her tutelage. The only real conditions were that she had to keep good grades, and that part of the reward for any mission undertaken while attending Beacon was given to the school. The percentage taken depended on what she earned, and she would have to give back more for higher-paying missions. When she graduated, though, the percentage would become a static 5% per mission until she had paid everything back. It was a rather generous agreement in Blake's opinion, and what had just been taken would cover everything she had received from Beacon so far, and probably even handle the rest of the semester. Once again, I want to press just how proud you should be of this accomplishment, he said with a smile and sat back. But that will be all. I'm sure you all want to get back to your dorms and lie down. I see you still have a little bit of recovery to go, but you still have lessons starting tomorrow. Yes, Professor, they all said as the man pulled out a slip of paper and a pen. It was clearly a sign that he had work to do, and one they all recognized since Glinda did the exact same thing with her scroll. So with nothing more than a nod, they all began to walk back to the elevator. However, Blake quickly noted that Ruby was barely with them. She had taken 2 steps before she slowed. Once again, the girl's face was a little downcast, and Blake held out a hand to take hers, only for it to be pulled away slightly. You okay? She asked quietly, as they both came to a stop. Yeah, Ruby replied with no small amount of uncertainty. You go on ahead. I'll meet you in the dorm. Blake looked back at Ojban, whose pen was scratching across the paper, but she knew he was paying attention. Are you sure? Ruby looked up at her and gave a small nod. Okay, Blake agreed. She leaned down to press a brief, reassuring kiss onto her girlfriend's lips, and was happy to feel the pressure returned. As she pulled away, she gave her leader a smile before walking into the elevator to stand next to Weiss and Young. She knew exactly what Ruby was doing, and hoped she got the answer she wanted as the elevator doors shut and blocked the Reaper from view. As she watched the doors close, Ruby played with the hem of her combat skirt. For almost 10 minutes, she had listened to Ojban praise her for her actions, congratulating her for finally taking out a Grim that had been making life on Patch rather difficult for over a century. And while she couldn't argue that it being gone was a good thing, she still felt like she didn't deserve the praise. She was trying to be positive, trying to look on the bright side, even trying to be happy. But she had still screwed up. Yang and Coco had correctly called her out on it, admitted she had made a mistake, and even Blake had scolded her for one of them. But everyone else kept praising her. Even Weiss, who would normally not hesitate to berate her for something, had said nothing about her decision to stay and fight. And all of it was starting to bug her. Is something wrong, Miss Rose? His voice snapped her out of her thoughts, and she quickly turned around. Ojban was staring at her intently with his pen unmoving. Knowing the man was busy, she tried not to take too long and gave a simple nod. She let out a deep breath and let her one good arm fall. I don't think I deserve the praise you've given me. Or the reward. MMM. The man hummed and sat back in his chair. I disagree, but you are welcome to try and change my mind. Ruby looked at the man as he smiled kindly at her. There was no condescension there, only genuine intrigue. I almost got my friends killed, she muttered. I didn't think about what would happen if we failed, and when we did, I panicked. We didn't win because we were strong, or because we were smarter. We got lucky. Ojban's smile fell, and he stood up. None of that is untrue. Her head hung at the acknowledgement. It may be what she wanted to hear, but that didn't make her failure any less painful. "But I feel you are missing something important," Ruby rose. She looked up to see the man staring out the window. "Do you know why this school is called Beacon? Why it is that all the combat schools in each kingdom share a common theme regarding their names?" Ruby had no idea what that had to do with her mission, but Ashpin usually had a roundabout way of getting to things. "No?" "Then let me give you a quick lesson." He motioned to his side, and Ruby quickly walked up to join him. The man said nothing for almost a minute, just stood there looking out the window towards Vale in the distance. But finally, just as Ruby stopped looking at him, but towards the city, the man began. "Nearly 80 years ago, the world was in turmoil," he said with a hint of sadness to his voice, like he was actually remembering it. "Kingdoms burned, grim flooded our streets, and people died. War ravaged every continent, every city, every town, every household. It was a time where mistrust was sown amongst everything. Allies turned on allies, friends turned on friends. Even today, we call it humanity's darkest time. But when it all ended, peace began. And from that peace, this very school, and all the others, was born. And names were decided for each. Names to remind people what was truly important. Atlas was named so to represent the world we inhabit, that huntsmen and huntresses work to keep safe. Shade was named so to remind people that those same people are looking over them. Haven was named as such so that everyone who looked upon the schools would be reminded that there was safety in this world. But Beacon was named specially. It was named after the one thing that is more important than any other: hope. Beacon was a name given to remind people that even in the darkest of times, no matter how bleak things may seem, there will always be light. There will always be hope." He turned to look at her, and Ruby saw that the earlier smile had returned to his face. "And in all my years of teaching here, I have never met a student who embodies that quality better than you, Miss Rose. Be it with Miss Belladonna, who is considerably different from when I last talked to her, or those who do not give you the easiest time here at school, you inspire them to hope. And just how much hope do you think you have given to Patch with your actions in these past weeks? It really is quite admirable, if you ask me." Ruby thought back to when she was leaving her home. The people had definitely been happier. She hadn't seen markets at the docks in years, hadn't seen people gathering en masse for longer than she could remember. While always friendly, the worry of the Grimm always made them keep their heads down and try their best not to attract much attention. But it had been so different when she left. Even Kelly had mentioned just how grateful she was. "But that wasn't me," she breathed. "You made those calls, and just because you got lucky, Miss Rose, that doesn't mean it wasn't you." Ashpin chuckled. "Huntsmen get lucky all the time. We are frequently caught up in situations where skill is not enough. Against New Grimm we have never fought, and it is never bad to have luck on our side. But I would advise against relying on it. Luck is a fickle thing after all. So if you truly feel you do not deserve this praise, that your abilities were not enough, then you are in the perfect position to change that. Practice, focus on your lessons and your teamwork so that the next time you are in such a situation, you can walk away proudly knowing that luck played no part in your victory." With those words, he placed a hand comfortingly on her shoulder and walked back to his desk. As he sat down, Ruby continued to stare out of the window. For some reason, Ashpin's words seemed to linger despite him being gone. She had frequently questioned why she had been allowed into Beacon early despite not even being the best of her year. Why she had been made leader. But was the answer really so simple? Was it really as Blake had said? That she inspired people to hope? But had Ashpin not just said as such? His speeches to the students often revolved around hope, so it wasn't hard for Ruby to accept that it could really be as simple as that. But the other piece of advice was something she definitely appreciated. Ashpin was right. She was in the perfect place to make sure luck was never the reason for her success again. If she really was going to be Beacon's example, really was going to inspire hope, then it was time she buckled down. So with a deep breath and a new purpose, she turned and made her way back to the elevator, only pausing briefly to give her professor a quiet thank you.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.